and we'll be focusing on Flutter, but we actually will touch on some other newer technologies as well. So it's kind of a state of the union on Flutter, given that there were some big announcements just 2 weeks ago. That Flutter event, known as Flutter Engage, event announced lots and lots of new things. So we won't quite touch on absolutely everything that was announced at that event, but we'll cover all the major stuff, and we'll certainly be available for questions at the end. We'll also talk about perhaps what's next for Flutter. So not just what was announced sort of 2 weeks ago, but actually where is it actually heading? And that's why we wanted to do a bit of a state of the union as well, and sort of say, okay, well, this is where Flutter's come from, this is where it's at right now, and this is where it's going. So we'll also discuss, what this means for Flutter, but more generally app development in 2021 and beyond. So just to get everyone on the same page, we're going to just touch on multi-platform just for a second conceptually. So we've titled this slide Cross-Platform Challenges of the Past. And the reason the word past is in there is because this table is just summarizing, if you like, the high-level choices and considerations when trying to choose, oh, should I do a fully native app or should I do a cross-platform app? So some of the major considerations are things like cost. Obviously, you're trying to use cross-platform to reduce the cost and time and to get a similar result. Code usability. With cross-platform, you're trying to use one single code base rather than separate code bases. But at the same time, you're trying to get device access, UI consistency, and performance that is commensurate and at least as good as native apps. Now, these were the challenges of cross-platform in the past, and I'll just quickly touch on that term for a second, cross-platform. That has a bunch of biases, history, and a lot of, it's a very loaded term. So one thing you'll notice is that we have been using the term multi-platform as we go forward. You should also know too that all the vendors also try to avoid the use of the term cross-platform because of all the baggage that comes along with it. And we'll get into that as to why that is in a little bit. So another thing to note about cross-platform too, cross-platform's been a bit of a vision and an ideal and a goal and something to strive for quite a few years, but the promise hasn't really delivered in spades, you might say. Now, this is just a couple of Google Trends, which are Google search trends, graphs about the interest on things like Flutter, React Native, Ionic, and Xamarin. Now, Ionic and Xamarin are slightly what you call older cross-platform frameworks, if you like. React Native is quite a bit newer, and Flutter is quite a bit newer as well. But things to note here are things like Ionic and Xamarin. If you go further back, you can see that they did achieve a certain level of popularity, but they have been waning in the last few years. And that's probably also due to the increase in popularity of things like React Native and now Flutter. The reason I've put up two graphs here is US largely drives the world, but the world data is just a little bit different. Now, I don't want you to think this isn't a particularly precise tool, but these Google Trends are sort of giving you some idea about sort of what's popular and how popular it is in the wider markets. But there are new multi-platforms. So some of the things that we really want to touch on today is the newer multi-platforms. Now, if you haven't perhaps heard of some of these technologies, React Native, Universal Windows Platform, Flutter, SwiftUI, Jetpack Compose, Kotlin multi-platform, don't worry, you're not alone. One of the reasons or one of the side effects of the vendors not using the term cross-platform is they've kind of been sneaking up on cross-platform functionality for quite a while. So, for example, SwiftUI, Apple describes SwiftUI as a framework. They don't describe it as a language. And obviously, SwiftUI is trying to provide a framework to deliver applications for iOS, iPadOS, tvOS, watchOS, and macOS. So things inside Apple's walled garden, if you will. Flutter is a little bit more broad brush approach. It's targeting both mobile, web, and desktop, but on iOS, iPadOS, Android Web, Windows 10, macOS, and Linux, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But as you can see from this table, there's a lot of activity going on in the multi-platform world, and it's okay, or you'd be forgiven for not actually having noticed in the last few years. And on that note, I might throw to Trev to talk a little bit more about Flutter.
Thanks, mate. Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about what Flutter is. So this is from Google, and I think it's actually really, really good. It says exactly what it is, and you cannot, I think, take out any one word from there and make it any better. But they did add one extra word, portable. Because I think what they're trying to stress here is that although it is across mobile, web, and desktop, the actual code base is portable across them as well. So it's a really succinct definition of what we have with Flutter. Now, so what is it? Well, Flutter is a declarative UI framework written using Dart. It's aggressively componentized. That is that everything in Flutter is a widget. So you build it up from the ground from your own widgets. The UI framework is built on top of a C++ engine, which is responsible for all the low-level graphics and talking to the platform that it's on via platform-specific embedders. This allows the apps to run natively on the devices that it's built for.
Okay. Now I might just talk about that in a little bit more detail. So we're going to show a small snippet from the Flutter Engage keynote for a very specific reason. So one of the big misconceptions that is still kicking around right now is when you do cross-platform or multi-platform, that you write it once, run it on all the platforms, and it looks the same everywhere. So people think that you do a cross-platform app for mobile, say on iOS or Android, and then it looks the same on iOS, and it looks the same if you put it on web, and it looks the same if you put it on desktop. We'll just quickly go through this short video which stresses that that should never really happen. You should always be idiomatic to the platform. In other words, you should always be leaning into and making sure that any apps you do for any platform follow the conventions that users expect on that platform. So let's just have a quick look at this.
Let's take a closer look at how the app works on different devices. Mobile devices are great because they're portable, follow us everywhere, and they usually have a camera built in. Given that, we focus the small screen experience around capturing content. Let's say you were on a walk and you bumped into Tim and his rabbit Carl. You could use the mobile-friendly UI to quickly navigate to an existing scrapbook and reminisce about shared experiences. Or navigate to your furry friends folio and snap a few pictures of Carl to add in later. Of course, larger screens provide a lot more space and improved precision, which makes them ideal for creative work, like editing a scrapbook. So when you get back from your walk, super excited to add in your new photos of Carl, you can fire up the app, maximize it via the native controls and the custom title bar, and use your scroll wheel or arrow keys to navigate to a scrapbook you're looking for. While editing, you can use desktop-specific idioms like multi-select, native menus, keyboard shortcuts, context menus, and scroll wheel zoom. But of course, not all large screens are the same. When working on a touch device, the UI adapts in a variety of ways, such as providing larger hit areas and exposing functionality through contextual buttons instead of right-click menus. Last but not least, we wanted to target the web. These days, browsers are capable of almost everything you can do in a native app, so the full app runs there as well. But the web is unique in the ease with which content can be shared. We leverage that strength to let you share a read-only version of your scrapbook. For example, to share your amazing new page with Tim and Carl, so they can follow along in real time as you make new updates. This URL is actually live right now if you want to go check out Carl. Of course, we barely skimmed the surface today, so I'd like to invite you to visit.
So just quickly there, in that video snippet, we saw iOS, we saw Android, we saw web, and we saw Mac OS desktop. And all that was the same code base. But of course, the app didn't behave the same, and there were lots and lots of differences depending on which platform the app was running on. So that's just to reinforce and to kill the misconception that, you know, things like Flutter apps or Flutter framework derived native apps actually look and feel the same on every platform. They do not. Anyone, if you hear anyone say that, please sort of question them on that, because it's actually not the case. Now, Flutter Engage was the big event 2 weeks ago where Google announced and the Flutter team announced some of the new announcements or some of the new functionality in Flutter, and it went version 2. Now, version 2 is a really big deal, really, for any framework, because it's a big signal or a big sign that we've gone beyond perhaps the foibles or mistakes of version 1, and we've got to a nice mature version, i.e. version 2. So this is the same reason, personally, I don't buy Apple Watch version 1 or a brand new form factor for a new MacBook. Version 1 often has problems. Flutter now, we're at version 2. And we'll talk about some of the foibles that we've seen as we've gone along. So just talking about version 2, here's a very brief history on Flutter and some of the major milestones. So one of the couple of key things to point out, it's been going since October 2014. So it's 6.5 years old. It's perhaps not as new as you actually may think it is. Now, it basically went up through internal alpha, beta, and version 1, surprise, surprise, was in December 2018, which is 2.25 years ago. So it's been quite a while since version 1, and a lot of us who have been watching Flutter fairly closely have been thinking, well, when's version 2 coming along? Because we know lots of things are changing, lots of features are getting added, lots of things are getting fixed. When's version 2 coming? And version 2 came literally last week. And that was great for us to see, because there was a lot more in version 2 than we had expected. That being said, there's a bit of a chance, and I won't guarantee this, but there's a hypothesis that I and a few others have, that version 3 will probably be as early as December 2021. The big Flutter events, and there's typically one per year, typically happen in December. This year was a little bit late because of the pandemic, but it's highly likely, and we'll talk about why in a little bit, that version 3 could turn up as soon as December 2021. Another thing, from a DiUS point of view, we've been doing commercial projects with Flutter for a little while now. Some of the names are listed here, but some of them are still confidential. So through this period is when we've been doing, real whole apps for using Flutter to produce, native iOS and Android apps primarily. Another thing to note too is that people like myself and Trev started to sort of hear about and then get into Flutter about that February 2018 timeframe. And myself, I sort of got into it around that sort of time, May 2017, around Google I/O. So we've been sort of keeping an eye on it, playing with it, experimenting, trialing it for quite a while now.
Okay. So the version 2 announcement had a whole lot of stuff in it. This is just some of the highlight ones. Now, as a developer, the thing that grabbed me immediately was Null Safety. I thought that was super exciting. Then I saw, oh, desktop early release. I got really excited about that. Then I saw, oh, Ubuntu. I got even more excited about that. But the real highlight here is stable web support. That is the major part of this release. So web went into the stable channel, which means that it's actually production ready. So before, when it was in beta, it was still pretty good. And I know quite a few people who had worked on websites using Flutter. I hadn't, because I was distracted with a few other things. But they've reported it being really good. So now that it's stable, I can't actually wait to get started on building something for web using Flutter. The other thing about having it in stable means that its release cadence changes. In stable, there is a release once a quarter, and so you know that the code you're building with now is not going to have any major changes for a quarter. So and you'll get notifications of what those changes will be, so you can update your code base as needed. Then there was desktop. Now, they've put this in the stable channel, but they've put it behind a compile flag. So what that means is that and this is actually really, really good, because when I want to start experimenting with desktop apps, I don't need to switch to a beta branch and do a whole lot of mucking around trying to get that to go. I'm in my normal stable channel, and I just add a flag, and I can experiment with it. I can use the existing code bases that I've got, and I can, and this will make it a lot easier to do my experimentation with. And it also, what this means is that Google will get more feedback about the things that need to be fixed, or change requests that can be made, because more people can do this, which is really, really good. So these are the platforms that are being targeted by Flutter. We have the existing platforms, mobile, web, and desktop behind the flag, of course. But in the future, they're looking also at embedded devices. So not quite available yet, but we know they are working on it. So it's pretty exciting stuff. So what was in the web stable release? So this is some highlights of what was actually added. Things like PWA support, which is pretty exciting, progressive web apps. Keyboard shortcuts, accessibility, rich text functionality, always a big difficult one to get in. And the interactive scroll bars. So now your scroll bars interact with mice and touch. So it's across desktop and mobile. So this is kind of where Flutter fits within the UI frameworks. So it's up there with the big ones that we know about: React, Vue, Svelte. Iconic. I don't know how that slipped in, but anyway, and even Angular. Well, you know, I don't want to get religious or anything. But it is just another web framework. Okay, it's not the one that's going to rule everything. It's got its own use cases, and it is just one of many different choices we can make. So currently for the web, Google are recommending that we use it specifically for web applications. So progressive web apps, single page apps, and like I even this last one, I'm a little bit, yeah, well, you know. So taking your existing Flutter mobile app and taking it to the web you could do that, but you might want to revisit some of the experiences users have. So you might want to change how you present interactions, like we saw in the video clip before. This is amazing. This is actually built in Flutter for web. It's a Roomba robot, stripped down Roomba robot you can buy, and you can drive it via code. So it's like a vacuum turtle. So it's kind of like Logo Turtle, if anybody remembers that, but with a Roomba. I reckon that is just awesome. This is a really fun site to play with for all you people who remember doing Logo. You can either do the snap and drag, and that works really nicely. And again, it's all Flutter. There's another level which you can have actually coded examples as well. And again, all run through Flutter. So it's a really amazing site. I do recommend people go have a look at it because it's really good fun. So one of the reasons it took a little bit of time to get web support out was because they decided to give us two renderers for the web. One was optimized for mobile, which is the HTML renderer, and one is optimized for desktop, which is the CanvasKit renderer. The CanvasKit renderer is obviously a lot larger, but gives you a higher fidelity, much better widget density, as it says there, and is very fast. So as far as a developer is concerned, you don't need to necessarily worry about that. When you build, you just let it do auto, and it will automatically decide which renderer to use depending on the environment it's in, or you can specifically target a particular environment if you wish. So what's next? So this release particularly is optimized for web applications, as I said earlier. We know that they are working on getting SEO much better for content-heavy sites, because at the moment that is an issue for Flutter Web. So yeah, that we actually don't have a release date for that, but we know they're actively working on it, and they're working very, very hard on that. So it'll be good when that comes through. So for desktop, as Mike said, they're looking at making it final by the end of this year, which will add a whole lot of extra pieces into it. The multiple window support's really interesting. At the moment, Ubuntu, it's working on Ubuntu because Chronicle are working on it, but they're going to be spreading that ability to the other environments, which is fantastic. And we have Universal Windows package. Is it package or platform?
Platform.
Platform, yeah. Support into stable, which will be really interesting because Mike was telling me before he's really excited about putting a Flutter app on his Xbox, so which is great. So we could have Flutter apps running Xboxes, which is pretty exciting stuff.
That'd be great.
Okay, so this was really, really a big thing. Sound Null Safety in Dart. So we're out of Flutter at the moment. We're looking at Dart. Now it sounds, pardon the pun, it sounds a little bit esoteric, and I guess it is, but what it does is it removes a whole class of runtime problems. Tony Hoare's $1 billion mistake, or that he claims that it was his fault that he introduced null pointer exceptions into all the programming languages up until now. This is an effort and a successful effort to remove it. The only other language that has sound null safety is Swift. Now, sound null safety is where the compiler can guarantee that the value it is just in a variable will never be null. As soon as it can do that, it can optimize the binary that it's producing to be much smaller and therefore much faster, and eliminates a whole lot of code branches, which eliminates a whole lot of potentials for other errors. This is a really major step to making Dart one of the top languages. Kotlin and a lot of other languages. Woo! Sorry, I had to take a breath there, Mike. Kotlin and some of the other languages have null safety, but it's not sound null safety because they can never guarantee that the variable will never be null because, well, for Kotlin, it is interoperable with Java, and Java is known to throw one or two null pointer exceptions every now and then. So we've got a problem with that. Okay, now, sorry, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Trev. Now, Flutter version 2. We didn't attempt to squeeze in, well, we actually did attempt, and the slides ended up being too long. We did attempt to cram in sort of all the announcements around Flutter version 2 and the Flutter Engage event. Here are some of the actual more notable ones. So Flutter accessibility is really good. You'll see a few people running around saying Flutter doesn't have accessibility. Not true. Flutter has really good accessibility. They do want to tweak a little bit, a few more improvements, but it's very, very, very good at the moment. This may be the subject of another Lunch and Learn at some point in the future. The other big thing that often stops frameworks being used in earnest is internationalization. Currently, if you use Flutter framework to build apps, you've got 78 languages currently covered. There's other things too, like new routing, or new page routing, which was added to help out with web support. And of course, there's improved performance stability and all sorts of micro fixes in the framework as well. Another one that caught my eye was integration testing. So up until now, you've had a bit of a tough time taking a Flutter app and putting it on AWS Device Farm or Firebase Test Lab. And these are device farms where you can test your apps on as many physical and simulated devices pretty much as you have money for. So it allows you to do really broad device testing on different versions of operating systems and devices from all sorts of vendors. Integration testing has been cooking for a while, and it's now just come out as part of Flutter 2 as being released. And I've personally run some Flutter apps and tested them on AWS Device Farm, and it works really good. Now, there are many, 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 many more enhancements and fixes and features to list, but we will be sending out a list of links after this event, just with some really great moderate detail articles about all that's new in Flutter version 2 if you do want to know more. So one thing we will say though is it hasn't all been unicorns and rainbows. So it's 2.25 years since version 1. And these are some of the things that have popped up sort of in that period and prior where it hasn't absolutely been ideal. So probably one of the first issues is Flutter gets a bit of criticism from having a lot of open issues. Now, these are issues that are logged on the Flutter open source code repository. Now, those numbers look pretty big. These numbers were taken a couple of days ago, but 8,465 open issues is a large number. But just putting that in context, it used to be larger, and the other thing is that it's also a mix of, that's not 8,465 bugs, it's 8,465 issues that anyone can log. And last weekend, I logged 3. So, Trev, yeah, my fault.
Yeah. So look, I look at this number and I think, yeah, that is a lot. But then I think, well, it does also show that this is a very active community. We've got a lot of people putting in, using the product, putting in either bugs that they found or requests for help, which are also answered too. It also, because like Mike said, it is highly active. So I've got 8,000 open and over 40,000 closed. So it is churning and people are using it and moving through. So I think this is actually a positive more than a negative. I'd be more worried about a very large site with only 2 or 3 open issues because that means no one's using it.
Cool. And the other thing that we've mentioned is search engine optimization for web is something that I've acknowledged needs a little bit of work. So what it means is that you shouldn't be using Flutter to go and replace, for example, in our case, the DiUS website, which is very text heavy, lots of content, and has a blog, for example. The focus at the moment for Flutter web support is web apps. And in some ways, that's almost the more complicated use case. But we know SEO for web is on the roadmap, and I have no doubt that they will give us some more tooling to help out with that. The third issue we've got here is one that's got a little bit of press too. A couple of months ago, we found issues where Flutter apps for iOS had a little bit of a janky start, meaning there was a little bit of, you could see a little bit of frame movement. That's not normal, but they have launched a specific project to look at that issue because a lot of people have been experiencing it. But that just goes to show that Google's more than willing to work with the wider community and focus on specific areas to make sure that they're optimized. Now, quickly touch on the ecosystem. So 150,000 Flutter apps in stores. That's a lot. They always publish this number, and I have to say, when I saw this, I was pretty surprised. I didn't think it would be anywhere near this number just yet, but it's large. So I guess the ecosystem of actual apps on iOS and Android, and some web ones too, and some desktop ones already, typically Mac OS, is starting to thrive. The other thing to note here that we've got a vibrant and expanding community. So we definitely have packages from some of the big names like Amazon, Microsoft, Adobe, etc. We also have packages which are akin to, for Flutter, akin to libraries or dependencies. We also have packages for just about everything we want. So we're not wanting for any key bits of functionality outside of the framework. Google Maps, sure. In-app purchases, sure. Lottie animations, sure. Sentry crash reporting, sure. There's almost everything we need. The other thing too is that besides the sheer number of packages and plugins we have, and it's somewhere above 15,000 by now, we're also getting groups of premium quality ones. So one of the things that happens when you have a framework, I mean, just think of the web and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of libraries for the web, you have quality issues. So what we're seeing form is groups of premium packages and plugins that are of extremely high quality and very well tested and rock solid. The other thing that came up too was federated plugins, and this is where it allows you to have a plugin, say for Google Maps, but it allows you to use that plugin in such a way where if Google Maps plugin supports iOS, Android, macOS, Linux, and Windows, you don't want all of the code supporting those platforms in the one plugin and making, say, your Android app a little bit fat. So what this allows it to do is to take out the platforms you don't want supported so your code doesn't actually bloat. Another big, for me, was a pretty big red flag was that Amazon has released their own Amplify Flutter SDK. That has become generally available a few weeks ago. So this is kind of a badge of honor. If Amazon produce an SDK in a particular language, then it's kind of a message to the market to say, yep, you've kind of made it. So at the moment, Amazon supports Amplify SDKs for iOS, for Android, for React Native, and now for Flutter. So that was a really big indication of a thriving community. Okay. So some of the other things that were touched on this particular slide were like who's using it, who's who in the zoo, who's actually engaged and actually using this stuff. So obviously from a Google point of view, this was a bit of a surprise though. So Google put up this slide or the logos for this slide in the presentation. You'll notice there's some heavy hitting apps here like Stadia, which we knew was already the companion apps Flutter. Google Pay, which has an installed base of 150 million worldwide, is now transitioning to a Flutter version of that app. It's not released yet here in Australia. It's being migrated, but yeah, there's some core Google products here that are using Flutter to produce their mobile and web apps now. There's a bunch of other companies as well. This is just sort of some of the companies that were shown. There's quite a lot more, but also you can visit the flutter.dev showcase page to look at some of the other companies, small, medium, and large, that are actually using Flutter. It's actually quite a long list, but go have a look at that page. But I should note that I think it's missing a few updates from the last couple of weeks, but it's a good one to look at. Now, this particular slide, this is showing the repository stars that devs place on open source repositories for React Native and Flutter. So this is probably showing the popularity of these two frameworks with the development community. Again, like the Google search trends data, it's not a very precise tool, but it gets you a bit of an indication of the feeling in the dev community and how well regarded these frameworks are. Obviously, React Native started and existed well before Flutter, but Flutter is sort of more than caught up, it seems, from a developer sentiment point of view, and sort of shooting through the threshold of where React Native's at. So what we can kind of say from this is that Flutter seems to be very popular with developers.
Yes, I'll agree with that.
Not just you, Trev.
Yeah.
This is another bit of Google Trends data, but this is showing something a little bit different to what we showed at the beginning. So Flutter, React Native, Jetpack Compose, and Swift UI. So Jetpack Compose is from Google to do sort of reactive and declarative programming for Android, and SwiftUI obviously is for sort of multi-platform Apple apps. Now, this is sort of just to give you a bit of a context of, out of these 4 new up-and-coming frameworks, you know, which ones are sort of how popular. Jetpack Compose and SwiftUI are sort of starting up. So Flutter's been around longer and seem to be getting a lot of the interest. So now we'll start to round up the presentation part of this talk. App development in 2021. So what are some of the implications of everything we've kind of talked about so far? So I guess the first thing is to reflect on the fact that multi-platform has been underway for years and it's probably snuck up on you. So you probably haven't noticed, mainly because a lot of the vendors are avoiding that word cross-platform at absolutely all costs. The other thing is that the advantages of multi-platform being reduced cost, time, complexity, etc., and to deliver a great customer experience with a native result. That's happening, and I'd have to say that the new multi-platform frameworks seem to be a lot better in this regard and seem to have avoided some of the problems that we outlined in that table at the beginning. The other thing is that there's practical opportunities that are now emerging in the use of these frameworks. So I've highlighted the word practical there because they really are practical and viable options now, and you probably should be considering them, even if you don't go with them, for pretty much any app you do on any platform these days.
Yeah, I'd just like to chip in there that that line about delivering consistent UI and features and release schedule is a huge one. That with something like Flutter, you can be guaranteed that on each of your platforms, you've got the same feature set for a release, and it's released at the same time with a consistent UI. That is just gold, just that one thing there.
Yeah, one thing me and Trevor also didn't want to do, because we put it in and the slides were too long, we had to take it out. But another thing we wanted to talk about was the decision that goes into choosing a framework or a platform, either for a re-architecting of an app or a new greenfields platform or a new greenfields app, should always be considered extensively and very, very carefully. And one of the things we're not saying here is we're not saying Flutter is fit for purpose for everything, because it's not. But it is, we think, a good option that you should probably consider going forward. And I guess to sort of sum it all up, to try not to think about just the traditional things you know about, say, mobile development or web development. Please go and have a look at some of the technologies we've touched on here and Flutter, and just sort of open your mind to the new possibilities, because the new possibilities are very much becoming practical alternatives rather than pie-in-the-sky visions for the future. And just to close out with Flutter, what we see, having looked, played with, used Flutter in earnest quite a bit up until this point, is Flutter is definitely maturing. It's probably past tense. It probably should be matured. And it's growing very fast, and it's very popular, and it's certainly delivering a lot of value for some of our clients. So it is all very much a very, very, very valid option. Trev, anything else you'd like to add to that?
What he said.
Okay, so just quickly, we've touched briefly, but Flutter at DiUS, we've been experimenting, evaluating, looking at it along with some of these other technologies and frameworks for quite a while. We've delivered 4 commercial Flutter projects to date. I won't go into them just now because this is not the talk for it. We'll continue to look at Flutter and the other technologies and try to figure out when it may be a good option and when it may not be. And I guess also watch this space, because we'll probably be presenting some more things on Flutter and some of these other new technologies soon. And before we go to questions, one thing we did want to do was talk about, okay, we've talked a lot about Flutter and some of the other technologies. How about we just show you some of them just to give you a bit of a sneak peek. So that was very much a marketing gimmicky sort of PR type video, but all those apps were new. We hadn't seen those in any promos before. You would have also noticed the Wallace and Gromit AR app, which actually uses a Unity engine with Flutter to do some 3D stuff and some augmented reality. And you also saw some internationalized apps in there as well. So just something to break it up a bit before we go to questions. Alicia, do we have any questions?
We sure do. Mike, I was just going to say off the back of that video, quite the hype video. I was quite enjoying the tune and the visuals. They did a really good job of that. Mike and Trev, thank you so much for taking the time to prepare this presentation. I'm sure, you know, that the people that are on the call have gotten some great value out of this. I have popped a link in the comment section of this Google Hangout that you can pop your questions in via Slido. Please get those in. We do have a couple. I just wanted to start off with one that came through quite early on. Really appreciate this person just acknowledging that we, unfortunately, and we do apologize, I didn't do a welcome to country at the beginning of the meeting. So in a non-traditional form, I'm just going to start off our question session with a welcome to country, just to acknowledge that. So I'm just going to acknowledge that we're meeting here on the lands of traditional custodians, wherever that might be. A lot of us are here virtually, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present. I would also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be attending this event today. So thank you to that person who acknowledged that. We do apologise for missing that in the beginning. Additionally, we have a couple of questions. So Mike and Trev, at the ready. First question is, given Flutter has been around for a few years, how hard is it to find Flutter developers in the market right now?
Oh, I'll grab this one. Very topical question. Good question. And so Flutter developers. So number one, I'll say that in some ways, I think even for the last couple of years, Flutter's success has probably surprised, I think, the industry and Google quite a bit. Now, what we find is that the market for Flutter developers is a bit split. So we have lots of students, amateurs, part-time people using Flutter especially to do iOS and Android apps, because they were the first two platforms that were supported. Very successfully and very happily, but we don't have tons and tons and tons of developers with commercial Flutter experience yet. So we are probably experiencing a little bit of a shortage of commercially experienced Flutter devs at the moment, but I have to say that is changing pretty quickly. I noticed a few ads for companies as well as our own in the last couple of weeks that are advocating Flutter for certain projects.
Yeah, I'd also like to add to that.
Yeah, go.
And yeah, there may be a shortage at the moment for Flutter devs, but one of the things is nobody was a Flutter dev when they started, so to learn Flutter is actually pretty straightforward, especially if you're coming from a React background, because Dart is very similar to TypeScript. There's a few differences, obviously, otherwise it'd be the same language. But the transition from one to the other is seamless. It's not painful at all. And so I think you can train up existing devs who want to be trained up into being Flutter devs quite quickly.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, that's actually what we do. So
yeah,
we've developed a kit to make Flutter devs. So if we can't find them or recruit them, we make them from existing devs. So take one existing dev, add in our particular kit and a bit of guidance and assistance for us, we can make Flutter devs, because it's really not that hard to learn Dart and to do Flutter. For example, my day job isn't development. DiUS doesn't actually pay me to do actual development every single day. And so I learn it and do it part-time and after hours. The other thing probably to note as well is that it's pretty quick, and it looks a lot like a lot of other code that you've used before if you're a developer of anything. I came from a web background and picked up Dart very, very quickly. Alicia, do we have another question?
We have quite a few coming through. We've got about 10 minutes or so to ask these, just to keep the questions coming in. In the case that we can't get to all of them now, we will hand those over to the Slack channel so you can engage directly with Mike and Trev there. Going on to the next one. So we've got one here that says, I can recall from working with Ionic that breaking changes would often occur between Ionic and native APIs. How does Flutter solve this problem?
Yeah.
Trev, next one, I've got an answer, but I'll let you take it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's actually a very, very good question. I think one of the main differences between Ionic and React Native, for that matter, and Flutter is that the others use a bridge that is relying on the native platforms to provide access and things like that, whereas Flutter doesn't. It does everything itself and is compiled down to a native app. So you generally don't get breaking changes. You get changes within the Flutter app or and sometimes the look, but you rarely get those type of major breaks that were happening in, I remember from Ionic in the early days. Did you want to add anything, Mike?
Yeah, probably just that it's something that we'd like to do a talk on. Flutter's architecture is actually not the same as React Native. It's not the same as Ionic, and it's not the same as some of those cross-platform older frameworks. It is quite different. But again, me and Trev started fleshing this out, but just to explain the architecture and why it avoids a lot of these problems, it's probably a whole talk in and of itself. If you would like to understand why a little bit more, though, there is an excellent, very long page about Flutter's architecture on flutter.dev. Look up flutter.dev and architecture, and you'll get a very clear, succinct explanation of the architecture. And from that, you'll see why a lot of these problems are avoided given Flutter's architecture.
Lovely, thank you very much. Next question, has anyone on the call done anything with server-side Dart, and how robust have you found it? Maybe Mike and Trev, if that one's for you, and then we can also maybe take that over to the Slack channel for a broader discussion too.
Yeah, actually, that's a good question. There are a couple of Dart frameworks for working on servers. One that comes to mind is Aqueduct, which is a Express type framework. I haven't built anything with it in anger, so I really can't comment on it. I just actually can't honestly comment on it. I haven't built anything with it.
Yeah, I'll just chuck in a shameless plug there as well. I know that there's a community event that will be presented by Brett Morgan from the Flutter team in probably a couple of months about, I believe he's going to talk about server-side Dart, and I believe it's a server-side rendering type talk about Dart on the server side, but just I'm not 100% sure, but it's coming up.
Cool. Thank you. How easy is it to interact with ML models, and does Flutter support embedding ML models written in frameworks like TensorFlow or PyTorch into the app?
I know there's a plugin for TensorFlow, but I'm not sure about PyTorch or anything. That would be a case of doing a search on pub.dev to try to find a package, and if it's not there, try to find a dev that wants to write a package to do it, because that sounds like a really a good area to expand into. Actually,
I can give a little bit more nuance to that answer. Yes, absolutely, it is supported. So the primary place you'd go is you'd probably use the Firebase, and I think it's currently called ML or ML Edge. You can use custom models with that Firebase feature, but you can also integrate TensorFlow directly with its own custom models. I haven't done the TensorFlow with its own custom models personally, but I've certainly seen example code and followed a couple of examples that allow it to be done. It's pretty straightforward, but it's not something I can probably point to an example off the top of my head. But yeah, quite easy to do. I've done it myself with ML Edge in Firebase, not a particularly sophisticated model, in that I just used some of the standard image classification models that come with Firebase. And again, I think it's called ML Edge or ML. But yes, you can definitely do it, and it's probably something we can explore in the Slack DiUS community channel later, if you like.
Lovely, thank you very much. Was there any talk of Flutter 2.0 supporting more VR and AR?
Well, I think I better take that one, Trev.
Yeah,
I've got a task at the moment internally within DiUS to do some more example apps on AR and VR. So ML Core and ML Kit, yes, there are definitely plugins. By the way, plugins are just packages that talk to an underlying SDK. They are around, but to be honest, I haven't got to that work yet. The Wallace and Gromit app that you did see briefly in that clip at the end, though, that does do AR, and it uses a very interesting approach. It's using Flutter with Unity Engine. Now, I saw that and got a bit excited. So instead of going to ML Core or ML Kit directly with a plugin, the Unity slant got me fairly excited. So I haven't done it yet, but obviously it can be done based on what we've seen with Wallace and Gromit. And let's face it, if it's good enough for Wallace and Gromit, it must be good enough for us.
Only you've got to choose.
Very good. Thanks, Jamie, for popping your name in. Jamie wants to know regarding integration testing for Trevor. Do the recent changes solve the issues that you've or we've had with AWS using Brighter Side Dev?
Oh, g'day, Jamie. Yes, it does. As Mike said earlier, with the integration testing, it does integrate now with AWS device farm. So that work that we were doing and could get the Android working, but not the iOS. Now it's just the both. Yeah, so definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I've personally taken a rather substantial personal project. And by the way, the package, if you want to refer to it, it used to be known as E2E. It's now called Integration Test. So it's not as young as it perhaps appears in pub.dev. Have a look, and I've actually run it through Firebase Test Lab for iOS and Android and AWS Device Farm for iOS and Android. It works really well. You can hook it up to CI/CD pipelines. It's really good sort of having this functionality now to be able to test on so many devices.
Lovely. I think we've got time for one more question. This one's from Toby. Again, Toby, thanks for popping your name in. Really appreciate it. Have you heard anything about reducing the size of the Flutter SDK for things like Apple App Clips? And could the work being done with embedded systems help this?
Oh, g'day, Toby. That's a big question. Sorry, could you repeat part of it? Because there was a lot in that.
Sure. Let's start with the first question. So, yeah. Have you heard anything about reducing the size of the Flutter SDK for things like Apple App Clips?
Actually, I can jump in there quickly.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything. I must admit.
So just on Apple App Clips, there is a page on flutter.dev that describes how to do Apple App Clips, but I believe that Apple App Clips are limited to 10 megabytes in size, and at the moment, with the framework, Flutter framework, and running the app clips, it exceeds the 10 megabyte limit. And I think there's a warning on that actual page on flutter.dev. I don't know of a solution just yet. I haven't heard anything in Flutter version 2 that's resolved that. So if you went to that page right now, I suspect that warning would still be present. It is something that I've talked about with, we've got some really hardcore iOS developers that have joined the DiUS team recently. I was just last night talking to one of them about doing a super tech deep dive on all things iOS for Flutter. So covering app clips, settings, stuff, anything and everything, launch screens, anything and everything you can think of that is idiomatic to iOS that people have got questions around, like Apple App Clips. Can we do them in Flutter, and does it come under the size limit? So that's a really good question. I think the issue still exists as far as I know, but also watch this space because, yeah, we'll hopefully present some stuff soon on everything you wanted to know on using Flutter to produce iOS apps.